Hey guys, what I wanted to do in this video was just take a quick moment to talk about some of the more advanced state rules that we have to follow when we are building our React applications. So up until this point, we've implemented state that only exists in one file. But what if, for example, you have an application that looks something like this, where you have the ability to create some posts. The posts will show up right here. We can edit the individual posts, we can delete the posts, and the number of posts should also be reflected in the nav bar. And what this example is trying to show you is that this state right here needs to be accessible throughout our application, not just in one page, but over in the nav bar component or over in the posts component, which we'll take a look at in a minute. This leaves us with a couple of questions. Where should the state live? How do we get the state to the other parts of the application that need it? How can we modify the state from other parts of the application? And I guess as an added bonus, how do we work with arrays when we're dealing with state? How do we just update one individual item? How do we just delete one individual item? All right, so those are the questions that we're going to be answering in this video. Okay guys, so for the sake of time, I went ahead and I already coded this application out already. So what I'll do now is I'll just give you a brief walkthrough of everything that we have here before I start answering all of those questions. So if you prefer to type it by hand, feel free to follow along and do that. Otherwise, I will provide a GitHub link to this repository, and all you would need to do is just check out the initial commit, okay? If you just do a quick Google search for git checkout, you will see how to accomplish that. All right, so to begin, all we really have here is a new create React app. What I did first was I went into the index.html and I went ahead and I grabbed the Bootstrap CDN for the CSS file and I pasted it in the head. And then I went ahead and I grabbed the Bootstrap 5 JavaScript CDN. So you can find those just by going to Git Bootstrap, and then if you just come onto their homepage right here, they should be giving you the current version. It may change in the future, but if you just come down here currently, what you'll see is they have JS Deliver, CSS is right here, JavaScript is right there. Moving on to the app.js, all we really have is a couple of import statements for some components that we'll make in a moment. I went ahead and I also created an initial state object right here, which is just an object that has an array called posts. And inside of here, I just went ahead and I put some sample data that we can use to see the posts on our page. All right, this is going to be our starting data. And then after that, all we really have is a class app component, and I went ahead and I made a constructor. I assigned my state to be the initial state right here. And then I just went ahead and I rendered out the various components on the page, okay? So we have a navbar, a form section, a posts section, and a footer section. Okay, and the only props that I passed in was for the navbar. I said number of posts is going to be this.state.posts, this array.length, okay, and that's how we are passing in that data into the navbar, like we'll see in a moment. And then I also passed in the posts into this post section component. Okay, so those are the props right there. Let's go ahead and take a look at the navbar component. Nothing too crazy here. All I really did was I went ahead and I grabbed a navbar off of the Bootstrap docs, and all I did was I just remembered to change class to class name, and then also keep in mind this is a functional component. Since we're in a functional component, we have to pass in props as an argument, and then we can access our prop that way. Okay, next we have the form section, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. I have a JavaScript file and a CSS file. Here is the CSS, and then moving on to the form section, all I did was I imported the CSS file, I imported React, and then I imported this form component that we'll talk about in a moment. But all I did was I just wrote some basic JSX here. We have a section which is called form section, and then inside of there we have a container, a row, and a column. These are classes coming from the Bootstrap grid system that allow us to position elements on our page. Okay, and then inside of here, we just have an H1, and then we have our form component, okay, which I am passing a styles prop into, okay, and we'll see how that gets used in a minute. If we go ahead and we open up that form right now, what we can see is we have some default styles and some initial state. Okay, this form is going to be the actual form that we see right here and right here within our component. And all I really did with the initial state was I just assigned it, and then I went ahead and I already created the handle change and the handle submit. The handle submit doesn't do anything yet. It just alerts the user that we submitted the form, and it resets the state back to their initial values. And then down here, we just have a basic Bootstrap form, okay? And the only interesting thing to note here is that for the style attribute, I said, hey, go ahead and use this.props.styles, the styles that we passed in, or go ahead and use these default styles right here. Okay, so there's that section of the page. Then moving down to the posts section, what we can see is that we have some boring CSS here, nothing too crazy. And then inside of the posts.js file, all we really have here is some JSX that renders a section, and then we have a container row column, aka the Bootstrap grid system, and then inside of here we call this .render posts, which basically just maps through the post objects that we pass down through the props, and then they render a card on the page, okay? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the posts are coming from right here in the app.js. We're just passing the state down into the posts section component. Okay, moving on to the card.js. This one has a little bit more stuff in it, but what we see first is a Bootstrap card. I just got this right off of the Bootstrap docs, and all I did was I just drilled down into the props to get the title and the description, which are coming from the render posts method that we created in the post section. We can see that for each piece of state data that we have right here, what we're doing is we're just mapping through that. And we're passing in the title, the description, and the ID, title, description, ID, into this card right here. And then from within the card, what we're doing is we're just accessing those values, okay? The one interesting thing to note is that we also have a Bootstrap modal right here, okay? And what you'll notice from the Bootstrap modal docs is that they need this data BS target right here, which has to be a unique ID for whatever modal that we want to open up. So in order to get a unique ID, I just said, hey, data BS target. This is gonna target an element with the ID, because that's what the hashtag is, with an ID of modal dash whatever the ID is, right? Which is what we're passing down from the app.js. And then right below that, we have a modal, which will be out of sight until we click on this button right here. And you can see that in order to get this to work, we had to give it an ID of modal dash this.props.id to match this right here. And the only reason that this has an ID and this does not is because this says ID right here. And this is how we target an ID. And all we're doing inside of this modal body right here is we're just rendering that form element that we already talked about. Okay, so I know it's definitely a lot of code to type by hand, so feel free to use the GitHub link if you don't want to have to retype all of this. And all I'll say is that if you are feeling intimidated with the amount of code, I would just say don't be. This is all concepts that we've covered in previous videos, and just figure out what everything is doing and how they're all related, and it'll make sense if you give yourself some time to digest it. Okay, but that's the starting point of our application. So without further ado, let's get into the tutorial portion of this video. All right, so the first question that we want to address is, where should the state live if it needs to get used in multiple places from within our application? First, let's begin by addressing the problem. We can see on the page here that we have 2 posts. And then what we see up top is a nav bar that reflects those number of posts. And as we build out the rest of this application right here, what we expect to happen is to have both of these components be synced up with whatever the state of these posts are. So as we add items through the form, as we delete them, the number of posts should be reflected up top, and it should match the number of posts that we actually have down here. So the problem is that it wouldn't really make sense to create some state that exists in 2 different places that would be reflecting the same data. So for example, I wouldn't go into the navbar.js file and create some state and some helper functions that could fire at the exact same time as the state that's getting used in the posts section component, right? We wouldn't want to make a helper function that could update in the navbar and a helper function that could update in the post section individually. We would want to just do it one time. So the solution and the rule that we have to follow whenever we have state that needs to be used and synced up in 2 different places is that the state data needs to be coming from one central file, one central location. And this one central location is going to be the operation center for your state. It's going to have the data. It's going to have the functions that can handle the modifying of that data, and it's going to be responsible for passing that data and those functions that can change the data as props to the children that need to use it. So let's take a look at the example here. And I know that this portion that I'm going to show you has already been coded out for the sake of time, but feel free to take this concept and practice it in a practice application of your own, or a real application. So if we take a look at the app.js file right here, our component tree looks like this. We're in the app.js file, and down here in the render method, what we're doing is we're returning a navbar, the form section, the post section, and the footer. And the 2 elements that need the data is going to be the posts section and the navbar. All the navbar needs is the length of the number of posts in our array of post data, and the post section needs the actual post data so we could display it on the screen. Here's the navbar data, and here is the post data being displayed on the screen for us. So we have these 2 components that both need the same data, so the rule is to have one central place for this data to live. And typically what you would do is you would go to the highest point in your application that you can where this data would need to be passed down. So in the context of this application, the highest point would be the app.js. And if that's confusing you, what we can do is just pop open our React Dev Tools that's coming from the Chrome React Developer Tools extension. And if we just click on components, we can take a look at our component tree right here. If I go ahead and collapse all these right here, you can see here's the highest point. Here is like the first component that renders everything else. We have an app, a navbar, a form section. Inside of there, we have a form. Inside of the post section, we have a couple more components. So if the navbar and the post section both need the state data, then all we would really have to do is just go back and define the state in the app.js file. And for the record, this is probably a little bit more of an art and not an exact science. I'm sure whenever you're working on a team, they will have conventions that they prefer for you to follow. But if you're just learning and coding on your own, try to just build your application in a way that makes sense, okay? But that is rule number 1 in a nutshell for you, okay? When you have state that needs to live in multiple places, go to the highest point in your application and then pass that state down via props right here. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, well, what about something like this? We have this form right here that needs to use some state. Well, what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, is this state being used by multiple different components? If we take a look at our app here, we can see that we have a form right here And then when we click on the edit button to bring up the edit modal, we have a form right here, okay? But they actually have different values. These are different forms altogether. If we take a look at our component tree in React DevTools, we can see that we have a form here, a form here, a form here. So they should all have their own individual values. You can see this one has some nonsense, this one has some different nonsense, and this one has some different nonsense, okay? So what we need to ask ourselves is, does this state need to be used from other components from within our application? The answer would be maybe, because eventually what we will do when we are coding out the rest of this application is we will use the data from this form to create a post. But I'll give you the short answer right now. When you are just building a form, nobody else needs to know what is being typed into these input elements. But whenever you call your handle submit method, that data can just be passed as a parameter to a helper function that can modify state from another file, okay? And if that was too much jargon for you, we will go over some very simple examples that will clarify that a little bit more, hopefully, okay? But in a nutshell, when it comes to where should state live, if there's multiple components that need to see the same thing, then there should be one central location. But if nobody else needs to interact with the state, then it's fine to just leave it in its own individual file. All right, so now we know that if state needs to be used in multiple places, we should have a single source of truth where the state can live, and we can get this data to the various components that need it by using props. So let's go on to the next topic of conversation, which is how can we modify the state in our single source of truth from within our child components that are accessing it. As an example, I think what we can do first is we can rig up this form that we have on our page to add a new item to our single source of truth array every time we submit it. So to begin here, what we can do first is we can open up this form section component that we have right here. And if we take a look in the form section component, what we can see is that inside of here, we're rendering the actual form component that is going to be in charge of dealing with all of the on-change handlers, the handle submit method, all that good stuff. So that's sort of the component tree we have. We have the app.js that has the state. And then what we're going to want to do is probably pass some data into the form section, which would then get passed into the form right here. So we have a few features that we need to implement. The first one being the ability to wrangle up all the data that we need to add to this array of data right here from within our app.js. And the second one being the actual handle submit method that will be in charge of getting the data that we wrangled and getting it to where it needs to be, the app.js file, the single source of truth. The first thing that we're going to want to do right now is we're going to want to pop open our terminal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to install a package that can generate a unique ID for us. And there's plenty of other ways that we could do this. I figured this would just be the quickest and the easiest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type npm install unique ID, which is uniqid. Okay, and this is a package that I found after Googling random ID generator package. And you'll see here that what they do is they just say npm install unique ID, and then they require it. But since we're using Create React App, which has Webpack and Babel already set up, we could just use the import statement. And then all we'd really have to do is just call this unique ID method, and it should give us a unique ID. So while that's loading, I'm just going to go ahead and type the code that I need. What we're going to do is we're going to import unique ID from the package that we are currently installing, unique ID. Okay, and then what I want to do just to test this out is I want to go down into the render method And I think a good way of testing this would be to just console.log this method that they're telling us that we can use. So let's just console.log ID, and then we'll call the unique ID function that they said we have access to from within their docs. Okay, and it won't be able to work just yet because this is still downloading the package. So I guess to avoid wasting time, what we can do right now is we can go ahead and update our handle submit method. So what we can do right now is we can just go ahead and get the state values of whatever was typed into the form whenever the onSubmit method was clicked. And I don't really have any form validation. That's a little outside of the scope of this video, but there are other videos that we've already done to cover that. So we'll go ahead and skip all the fancy form validation stuff. But what I want to do right here in the handle submit is I think I just want to make a constant variable that's going to have the form data, which is going to be the form data that the user had just typed in. Okay, and we're going to say that is going to be an object. And what we're going to do is we're going to give this object a title property, which will be equal to this.state.title. And it's going to have a description property, which will be equal to this.state.description. Okay, but we can actually clean this up just a little bit by using some destructuring and some ES6 syntax. Okay, so what we can do here is instead of typing this.state.title, this.state, you see we got some repetitive code here. What we can do is we can declare a variable and then put a pair of curly braces, and then what we'll do is we'll say this is equal to some object, and that object that we want is going to be this.state. So now inside of these curly braces, what I'm doing is called destructuring. What I can basically do is pull these state values out of this state object that we have right here. Okay, so what we can do is we can say title that says give me just the title out of this state object, and then we also want the description. Okay, and then we can clean our code up down here by saying title. The title is going to be title, and then the description is going to be description. Okay, so this is destructuring right here. You basically just say a pair of curly braces is equal to an object, and then from within those curly braces, you can pull out variables that exist from within that object. Okay, but we can clean this up one more time. We can actually get rid of this colon title and this colon description right here. And you may be thinking that looks a little weird because objects need key value pairs, right? But if the key and the value have the same name, then you actually don't need to say title colon title or key colon value. You can actually just remove this altogether, and you have some shorthand syntax for the key value pairs of your object. Okay, but that's just a little bit of cleaner syntax. It's not terribly necessary to do, but I digress. And it looks like our package finished. So I think instead of just console.logging it down here, I think what we can actually just do is we can just come down here, and then we can give this an ID property. And what I want to quickly just do is make sure that these values are matching up to the values in my single source of truth. So let's see here. Inside of our single source of truth, we have a posts array, which has some objects that have a title, they have a description, and they have an ID. Okay, perfect. So then all we want to do is call this unique ID function. Okay, and then I think what I want to do is just alert the browser whenever this is submitted, the form data. Okay, so we can just take a look at whatever happens here. So if we go ahead and start our application, and then we take a look at our browser, okay, what we can do is we can just put some nonsense in here, title test, description test, okay, and we should be able to hit submit, and all we see is submitted. What is the issue here? Okay, and I'm not really sure why whenever we submit, we don't see the data that we put in the alert. Maybe the alert has an issue with putting just a straight up object in there. But what I decided to go ahead and do was just console.log form data. And I can see that whenever I submit my form, I get some form data showing up right after the alert. I don't really care to debug this alert right here because it's not even really, it's just for testing really. So I don't really care. We'll just go with the console.log test, and we can see that we're getting our data, test, here's what we typed in, and then we're getting a unique ID right here. Okay, they're unique, all right? So the form is ready to go, and now all we need to do is we need to figure out how can we get this form data that we have right here to where it needs to be, the single source of truth. All right, so this next concept I'm about to show used to really confuse me, but it just took the process of me doing it on my own a handful of times before I went from being confused to feeling comfortable with it. So after I show you how to do this, I just recommend that you try to do it on your own in your own unique example to really solidify what we're about to do right now. So what we have here is some data that lives inside of the app.js file, and we want to create a way to add some more data to this posts array that we have. So what we're gonna have to do in order to add something to this array is we're going to have to create a helper function that can take some data and add it to the array. Sounds simple, right? So what we can do is we can go ahead and we can come down into our component right here, and let's go ahead and let's make that helper function. What I'll do is I'll just go ahead and call this add post, since that's what we're doing here. It's going to be an arrow function, and that will prevent me from having to bind it in the constructor. This dot add post equals this dot add post dot bind this. I won't have to add this line right here because the arrow functions don't have a this keyword, so the context of the this keyword won't get lost in translation like it would with a regular function like so. Okay, so we'll go ahead and make an arrow function. That's going to be our little helper. And what this helper function is going to do is it's going to take some post data. This is going to be the data that is coming to us from our form right here. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to update the posts array that is inside of our state to have everything that is already in it, in addition to this new object that we're passing to it. So I think what we can do right now is we can just create a new variable to start off with. Let's just call this const. I'll call this new posts array, okay, because that's what it is. And this array is going to have a couple of things. The first thing it needs to have is everything that already exists from within our state array. So we can do that by saying this dot state dot posts. Okay, that's going to give us this array right here. And what we can do is we can use the spread operator, which is just 3 dots, which is going to give us all of the values from within an object or an array. So since we write dot 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 this dot state dot posts, we basically take all of the items in this array and we just put them into this new array that we're creating right here. And then all we're going to want to do after that is just add on the post data that we're going to put in here from our form. Okay, so we can just tack that on to the end right here. We'll call that post data since that's the name of the parameter that's going to get passed in. And then all we have to do is call this dot set state. Okay, and what we want to do is update the posts array to be this new posts array that we created right here. And if you really wanted to, maybe you could just call this posts. And then if you remember the ES6 syntax that we just talked about, is if the key and the value have the same name, you can just use the shorthand and just pass in the name of your variable, and it will assign a key of the name of the variable to be whatever its value is. Okay, so we would overwrite the posts object with this new array that we created right here. So one quick thing that I want to mention right now is if I was coding on my own, if I was at work or if I was working on a freelance project, I wouldn't go for the home run like I am now. I would probably take my time and console.log posts just to see what I get, and maybe just rig up a little button right here that I can test right now, just so I can make sure that I'm testing things as I'm going and that everything is as I expect it to be. Okay, but I'm not doing that here for the sake of time, and also because I've done this many times and it's sort of like muscle memory to me at this point. But in the beginning, it was absolutely necessary to have a problem-solving process that included lots of console.log testing, maybe drawing pictures on paper. And the other thing that you need to know is that I am showing you an algorithm right now that we're about to finish up, but this does require a little bit of foresight, okay? Because I said, hey, we're gonna have some post data that's gonna come from our form, and then somehow we're going to update the state, right? And like I said, I've done this before, so I already know that this algorithm I'm gonna show you exists. But if you haven't done something like this before, it would require a little bit of planning and a little bit of thinking about how you're going to get this data to where it needs to be. Okay, because once we get past the conventions and the practices that we have to follow from within this React framework, it really just comes down to working with data and knowing how to get data from one place to the other and writing algorithms and being able to think and apply a problem-solving process. So I don't want you guys to forget that that problem-solving process is the bigger picture thing that we need to become masters of. So I just wanted to say that we're going over React concepts right now, but algorithms are still a very fundamental thing that we need to be good at, working with data and solving problems. Okay, so with that out of the way, we have our little helper function ready, but the only problem that we have right now is that this function is right here inside of our app.js file, and our form data is over here in the form.js file. So how are we going to get this form data into this parameter right here so we can update the state from within our app.js? Okay, and that's the problem that we're facing right now. So let's see how we can actually do that. All right, so we want to use this helper function to modify the data from within our single source of truth. But how can we do that when our function lives inside of the app.js file, but the data that we need lives inside of the form.js file? Well, you may already know the answer. It's the same way that we got the data from our single source of truth into the child components. Can you take a guess as to how? Well, if you guessed props, then congratulations, you're right, okay? So you don't actually have to only pass down little pieces of data as props. You can actually pass pretty much whatever you want, functions included. So the workflow that we're going to end up doing is we create a helper method that can modify some state from within our single source of truth, and then all we have to do is pass this helper method down into our child components where the data lives, and then whenever we call that method with the data that's coming from our child component, the function will call this.setState, but it won't point at the child component's state. It's going to point at the single source of truth state, right? Because that's where we defined it. This is where our state lives. This is where the functions that modify our state live. And all we have to do is pass it down as a prop and use it in different places, but it will all update the state that lives from within our single source of truth. Okay? Get used to the term. I'm just going to keep saying it. So that's the high level overview. Let's go ahead and let's see if we can actually do this. Okay, so we already saw that our component tree was the form section. So what we're going to do is let's just give it a prop of add post right here. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to pass down this dot add post. Okay, that's the function that we created. So let's go ahead and let's go into the form section, and I actually am going to do some console.log testing here, just so we can see if our little helper made it to where he needs to go. So let's say form section props right here, and then we're just going to console.log this dot props. Okay, we're basically sending our little child off to school. We want to make sure he made it to the bus stop. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's clear out the console, and then I'll refresh the page. And then if I scroll up, I can see that whenever the form section component renders, we're console.logging form section props along with the props that we passed in. And if we expand this out, we see add post, and it looks like we have a function right here, and that is what we expect to happen so far. But he doesn't need to stop here. He needs to make it to his destination, because the data that we want is inside of the form.js component. Okay, this is where the data lives. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to pass this prop down one level deeper. Okay, so what we can do is we can just come into this form component right here, and what we can do is we can say add post. Okay, and it's going to be this dot props dot add post. Okay, because that was the function that we passed in right here. Okay, if I called this noodles right here, then trying to pass in this dot props dot add post would not work, because my prop is called noodles now. Okay, but that's a little bit confusing. Let's just go ahead and keep it add post, and you're just going to want to make sure that the variables that you're using are matching up to what they need to be. I know for me personally, naming everything the same thing like I am here kind of got a little bit confusing. So if you would like, you could change the names of these to be slightly different and do some console.log tests just to see what everything is as you're passing it through, to hopefully help you conceptualize what everything actually is. Because I know for me, it was kind of difficult to understand this at first. Okay, but our little helper made it all the way here, and now all we want to do is pass him one level deeper into the form.js file, which we did right here. Okay, so now the form.js file should have a prop of add post. Let's just go ahead and test this out right now. What I'll go ahead and do is I'll come into the render method, and I'll just console.log this.props. And you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and change the name of this just so we can be descriptive. I'm going to call this add post method, just so we can see some different stuff coming through. Okay. So if we go and we take a look now, if we refresh the page here, we can see that we get a couple of empty objects, and that's because these cards right here, they also have forms, right? But the form that we're passing data into is this one coming from the form section. Okay, so if we scroll up, we can see that this form section is getting a styles prop, and it's getting an add post method prop. Okay, so what we can do is expand this out, and there is the add post method that we just passed through. Now all we're going to have to do right here is we're going to have to make use of it from within our handle submit method that's getting called whenever the form gets submitted right here. Okay, so what we can do is we can come into our handle submit method, and what we can do is we can call this .props .add post method. I'll just copy that, I'll paste it right here. And if we take a look at our app.js file, we can remember that we expected to see some post data, and then what we'll do is create a new array with everything that exists in our state right now, in addition to the data that we're passing into it. Okay, that creates our new array, and then we update our state with all of these new values. Okay, So what we have to do is pass in this prop of post data right here, okay? And that post data is gonna be this form data that we created a little bit ago. So I'll just copy that, I'll paste it right here, and then I'll go ahead and save. So one quick thing that I want to point out is that a function does not get called until you pass to it a set of parentheses right here. So when we were passing this down, we were just saying, hey, we want to pass an add post prop, which is going to be equal to this function called add post right here. Then we came into the form section, and then we said, hey, we want to give the form.js file a prop of add post method, which is going to be this .props.add post. But we weren't actually calling this function until we used it right here when we passed a set of parentheses, okay? So I just wanted to call that out in case it was causing any confusion. So the moment of truth has arrived. Let's go ahead and see if we can create a new post. I'm just gonna say jargon, because that's the first word that appeared in my mind for some reason. And then I'm just gonna say dingus, okay, as the description. It's a very good post. So let's click submit. Our posts go away, and are you ready? I'm gonna scroll down in 3, 2, and oh my goodness, there is our jargon dingus post right here, okay? So that is the entire workflow right there, okay? Definitely a good amount of steps. And one thing I'll mention is that passing functions down from one component to the next can be a little bit error prone in case you have a typo, and a little bit tedious. And that's why there are things like Redux or MobX, which are state managers, who their sole purpose is to prevent you from having to pass things down the component tree. Because imagine if you had to go down 10 components deep to pass in your component. That would not be fun. That would not be fun, okay? But hopefully that wasn't too confusing to understand. Really, in a nutshell, when you have state that needs to be used in multiple places, it needs one place where it can live. You can pass that state around to the child components using props. And you can also modify that state by creating an algorithm and then putting it in the same place that your state lives. And then you would just call set state with whatever data you have. And then you can make that function mobile by passing it as a prop, the same way you would do with the data that we've been doing in other videos. Okay, so that's the entire workflow. What I can do now is go over a couple more examples. I'll go ahead and I'll do the delete method. And then as an added challenge, I want you guys to see if you can figure out how to do the update method, right? How can we use these forms from within our cards to update the state data? All right, so what we're going to do now is follow pretty much that same workflow of coming up with an algorithm and passing it down into the components that need it, and then calling the helper function from within those components. So what I'll do first is I'll create a method called delete post, okay, which is going to be an arrow function. And as I'm writing this, I'm wondering, how could I get this thing to work? Well, the foresight here is that whenever we click on this delete button, we want to remove this specific item from our single source of truth array, okay? And we have unique IDs available to us from within that array. We have some sample IDs right here, and then we saw that inside of our form.js component, we use the unique ID package to create a unique ID and add that to the single source of truth array. So what we can do is we can use this ID as a key to figure out what specific post object was clicked on to be marked for deletion. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to fix this typo right here, and then we're going to come down here into our delete post, and we're going to create a new array which is going to be the updated array that has one of the posts taken out of it. Okay, so we'll call this posts again to follow this shorthand syntax that we already saw. And what we're going to do is make use of the filter method, which works very similar to how the map method works, where it has some predefined parameters from within the callback function. Okay, so if we say this.state.posts.filter, okay, as I mentioned, it's similar to the map method, where it creates a new array from the previous array, okay? And the predefined parameters that it has access to are the current item that it's looping through, because these higher order array methods just loop through an array and do something every time. So the first parameter of this callback is the current item, then the current index, and then the array itself. And the names here do not matter. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this post. Okay, so the first time we loop through, our post is going to be this first object. Then the second time, our post will be this second object right here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll expand this callback function that I'm creating right here. And what filter does inside of the body of its callback function is it expects to see a true or false value. And if the expression that we're returning is true, then we will add that current item to our array. And if it's false, then we will filter it out of the array. Okay, so what I mentioned was that we can use the ID as a key, right? So what we're going to want to do is loop through the array and then check to see if the current item that we're adding to this new posts variable, this new posts array right here, we want to see if that ID is the same as the ID that we are going to pass into it from our post component right here. Okay, so what we'll do is say post.id is not equal to the clicked ID. Okay, and that clicked ID is going to come as a parameter to the function, right? So it requires a little bit of foresight of figuring out how you're going to get this data to where it needs to be. But we know that these posts all have the data and they all have the ID. And we can click on one of these and get the ID data from this post, send it to the function, and then what we'll do is loop through the entire array and only add items into the new array if the ID that we're looping through is not the same as the ID that we just clicked the delete button for, okay? And if that's confusing to you, I just recommend that you draw it out on paper. You would console.log some things for yourself. So maybe a better workflow would be passing a helper function down to where it needs to be, and then writing the algorithm with console.log statements and seeing where you're going from there. Okay, but as I mentioned, I've done this before, and that's why I'm just blasting through it. Okay, don't feel like you need to go as fast as I go. So this is the algorithm and I expect it to work. So what I'll go ahead and do is just call this .setState, and we're gonna update the posts to be this new posts array right here. Okay, so now that we have our function created, we need to figure out where does this thing need to be. Well, we have some posts right here, and these guys live from within the posts section, okay? So here is our posts section component. What I'm gonna go ahead and do is I'm going to add a new prop. I'm gonna call this one delete post, which is going to be equal to this dot, the name of my function, delete post, okay? Delete post. And then from within this posts section right here, what we have is a helper function that is mapping through the posts data that is coming from the state from within app.js, okay? And for each object that lives in the app.js state, we're creating a card component with the values that are coming from that object. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take this helper function that we just passed into the posts section, and we're going to want to give it to each of these cards as we're looping through the array and creating the cards dynamically. Okay, so we can go ahead and do that from within this helper function right here. What I can do is I can come in here, and I'm noticing now that I didn't give the outer element a key, right? Which is what React needs to do its job. So let's just go ahead and add that in. We can say that the key is going to be the post. If we look at our data, post.id right here. Okay, so post.id. And then we also want these cards to have a prop of, let's call it delete post. Okay, that's how we're going to delete our posts. And this delete post is going to be the same as the prop that we passed in right here into the posts section. So we called this delete post right here. So in order to get that function, what we have to do is we have to say this.props dot the name of the prop that we passed in, delete post. Okay. And I know that delete post is here, here, and here, so it could get kind of confusing. So just keep in mind it might be a little bit more helpful to name these things different so you can get a better idea of what everything is. Okay, but if you're not having an issue, then we can just go ahead and keep the same naming convention, whatever works best for you. Okay, so from here you may want to do some console.logging to make sure that it got through to the other side, but I'm pretty confident that it did. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up this card component. Okay, so we'll go ahead and say card, and then from within this card we should have access to something called delete post, which is going to be this helper method we created in our app.js file. Okay, and when do we want this thing to happen? Well, whenever we click on this button here from within our card, that's when we want to delete the post. So what we can do is we can say on click, okay, and then we'll just give it the prop that we passed in to the card, which we called delete post. Okay, so we'll say this.props.delete post. Okay, and if we take a look at the helper function, we expect to see the ID that we just clicked, and that ID is available to us from the ID prop that we're already passing into this card. Okay, so what we can do is we can say this.props.id, and this is looking a little sloppy, so we could definitely clean this up, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to leave it as is. And if we take a look at our app right now, we can see we have no posts. Where are our posts? Where I didn't click anything. And if you remember what I mentioned earlier, a function does not get called until you pass it a set of parentheses. But what happens here when we say, hey, we want our onClick property to be delete post, and we have to pass in the ID right here? Well, the issue is that this function is getting called right away. So in order to solve this, we would need to either make this an arrow function that would then call this right here, or we could alternatively come out here above the render method, maybe do it a little bit cleaner, and let's just call this delete. Okay, and it will be an arrow function, and what it's going to do is it's going to call delete post, but I think I actually will go back on my word and clean this up. Let's go ahead and use destructuring one more time. This.props is an object, and the values that we want to pull out of it are delete post and ID. So let's go ahead and pull some values out of our object. We have delete post and we have ID right here. And then all we have to do is call the delete post method that we're passing in with the ID that we're also passing in. And then all I have to do right here is just take this guy away, and then I'll say, hey, on click. Whenever you're clicked, what we want you to do is call this dot delete post. Okay, but if you remember, we won't pass in the parentheses because we only want this to run whenever it's clicked. Okay, so we will omit the parentheses for now. And this formatting looks a little funky. I'm just gonna leave it alone. And we're finally at the moment of truth. Let's go ahead and refresh our page right here. We can see the posts are here, and I'm gonna click it. Are you ready? Oh, nothing happened. Okay, and I just figured out what my issue was. I kind of went through and put a couple of console.log statements, right? Which is why we should always test as we go. And I just realized that I called this delete right here and not delete post. So I guess I'll just go ahead and change this to delete right here. Okay, so now if we save it, the real moment of truth, that last issue was totally planned, and oh, we're able to delete a post. Oh, okay, and then we can add a post and put some stuff in here, and oh, it's gone again. And you can see the nav bar is updating, our state is in sync, and we have a nice little application. And this may seem a little lackluster, but the concepts can carry over to pretty much any application that you may want to create, okay? So go ahead and do your best with the updating example if you'd like to do that. The update method will be a little bit of a combination of both of these things in addition to following that workflow that we just talked about, okay? So go ahead, do the best you can, take all the time you need, and feel free to reach out if you are having any issues. And as always, thank you for watching. Catch you guys in the next one.